Welcome to the podcast. I have a special treat in store for you today. I have been very open about the fact that I am not the only person who talks about federal and private student loans, and also the fact that there are people who are just more tuned in, especially when it comes to legal challenges or just the depth in which they dive into federal student loans. I have probably the person that I'm speaking about the most when I make those references on the podcast today. His name is Stanley Tate. And he's been someone whose knowledge I've just admired for a very long time. And it's just a good guy. So Stanley, if you could give a brief introduction of who you are, and then I will dive into kind of why we're here today.
Yeah, well, I'm a Howard-trained lawyer who has been practicing in the kind of student loan space for the past decade now. My entire law practice, all we do is help borrowers with federal and private student loans, including worrying about how to qualify for forgiveness programs, lower monthly payments, negotiate settlements, or even go into bankruptcy and deal with the debts there. So been doing this now for about 11 years, and it's getting increasingly chaotic and complex, but it's one of the coolest things I've ever done.
You know, I was talking to somebody and I said, it's a field that I wish didn't exist. But unfortunately, the crazier it gets, the more entrenched our field becomes. So it's an unfortunate, fortunate thing. So I definitely know what you mean. Well, let me explain to the audience why I asked you to join us. I've shared this off air, so I'll make sure I compliment you on air. You had a newsletter that you released about a month ago that I thought was fantastic and expressed a reality that not many people, including myself in the space, have expressed, which is the fact that there are some instances where a person is asked to make a payment that they quite literally just cannot pay, right? And before we even get into the details of that email, can you tell me what's the level of frequency that you're coming across people where it's like, no, dude, there's no option here. They're asking me to pay $800. I quite literally can't afford that.
Yeah, I think that's actually a smaller subset of the overall borrowers. For the most part, I find that borrowers are able to afford their monthly payments. They may not like it, but given enough runway to work things out on a budget side to kind of clean some things up, they're able to afford it. But then I have maybe 3 out of every 100 who literally can't do it today, maybe not even next year, given their options. And usually those are going to be people who they're typically single, they're typically higher earners, we would call them, but it doesn't feel that way when you're earning low six figures in a high cost of living city like San Francisco, and they're usually like a single parent. And so they're just generally leveraged in a lot of different ways that make this federal student loan payment pretty hard to keep up with. And I'm focused on federal student loans because private is a different story. I think you wanted to kind of keep your federal. So just from a purely federal perspective, that's the type of borrower that I see. It's small, but they're out there and they're usually someone single with child, and they do well on paper, but they are definitely leveraged across the board.
Well, I think that some of the lessons and the tips that you gave to that 3 out of 100 are at least helpful knowledge to have in your back pocket for the other 97. So what I'd love to do, and I'm going to put a link to the newsletter in the show notes just so you all can see it. And I highly encourage you all to check out Stanley and his resources. They're excellent. But in that newsletter, you tell a client case of a client who earned about $200,000 and was living in the Los Angeles area. They were recently divorced, so they had to pay alimony, child support. They had 2 young kids, and they could not send their kids to private school because of some learning differences for each, or couldn't send them to public schools, because of learning differences. So to your point, this person is highly leveraged, and they're being faced with a student loan payment that they simply can't make. So I want to go step by step through some of the things that you at least wanted to put on this person's radar. The first thing that you discussed in that newsletter was strategically using your forbearances. So could you please share a little bit about how you would do that?
Yeah, and so what we have to keep in mind is that federal student loans are quite generous in your ability to pause payments or adjust payments based on the income within reason. But the ability to pause payment is really unique in comparison to a mortgage or a car note in that you can pause your payments with a forbearance for a year or at a time. And then you get up to 3 years of these like discretionary forbearances. Then you have different ones for economic hardship or employment and things like that. So there's multiple ways to pause your payments. Now, the trade-off is interest continues to accrue during that period. And there was a time for several years, decades even, where when you took that forbearance, you paused those payments, they were added to your principal balance. So you get this tremendous benefit in being able to pause payments for an extended period. But then the cost to you is that your principal balance will actually grow. And so in the future, you're paying interest on interest.
if they were to use or if you were to use your pay stub as one of those forms of verification, are they going to look at your gross income before taxes and deductions, or are they going to look at your net income?
Generally speaking, they're going to look at the income less you certain allowable contributions like a 401k, 403b, things of that nature. So they're not going to look at the absolute net after taxes and things like that, but they are going to account for those types of deductions, those above the line deductions that would show on a tax return. And so the way that I do it for my clients, when we apply for income driven repayment plan and we attach a pay stub, we're going to write on there the kind of the pay frequency, whether it's monthly, bi-weekly, every 2 weeks, whatever. But then we're also going to highlight those above the line contributions through a 401k, HSA, things of that nature to make sure they get properly accounted.
Yeah, this is something that, again, we haven't talked about it on the podcast, but in terms of our one-to-one work, we've had plenty of scenarios where we have someone who got a huge bonus last year or a new grant of restricted stock that they're not going to get this year. So we tell them to use a pay stub. We've also had scenarios where maybe their spouse has, experienced a drop in pay, or even someone who has like a really large investment account that's a non-qualified investment account that's kicking off gangs and things of that nature. Hey, that might be an extra $20,000, $30,000 of income between that and a high yield savings account that shows on your tax return but doesn't show on a pay stub. And so it's definitely something that we often recommend. You want to keep going? The next recommendation, and this was one that I had never seen talked about, and it was returning to college, but in a unique way.
Yeah. And so the way historically, like and I guess let me frame it this way. There was a time when the government did not offer income-driven repayment plans. Those didn't exist till 1994 was the first one. And even then, the first one they offered, income contingent repayment, was still really expensive for a lot of borrowers. And so what do? You don't want to default and hurt your credit, but you can't afford the payments they're offering. And the advice at the time was, well, I'll just stay in school, right? And makes a lot of sense. But the problem is 10, 20 years later, you've borrowed more loans and you've had this capitalization with these forbearances, this in-school deferment that's added to your principal balance. So now a $20,000 problem is a $200,000 problem, which I say that and it sounds extreme, and it is, but it's actually reality for a lot of people. Now, take on a history journey because we can look to history to say, okay, how can we do this better in the future? And one of the ways I thought about it, well, in order to take advantage of that in-school deferment that happens once you enroll more than half time, you could take out loans, but you also could just pay for the school out of pocket. And so if you're just doing kind of a math problem, you say, well, my monthly payment projected that they're offering me, which I can't afford, is say $1,000 a month. Well, that's $12,000 for the year. Maybe to go to your local school, it may cost you $5,000 for that year. And so then you're able to take advantage of the in-school deferment and pay for it out of pocket, and you still end up cheaper than you would otherwise in borrowing more loans. And it's also a benefit too, because now borrowing moving forward is kind of capped in with this one big beautiful bill. Borrowing new loans kind of changes some of your repayment obligations. So it gives you this protection of not having to pay in-school deferment, and you're not worsening the problem even more. You actually have some mitigation effect there, but it does cost you something, just not as much as you would pay otherwise.
And I thought that was really unique and creative and also potentially beneficial because to me, when people talk about student loan payments, leverage is important, even if you're a high income earner. But I also am like, hey man, there's not much that an extra $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 worth of income can't solve. And if you're going back to school and sharpening that skill set, it's like, well, shoot, I'll pay a couple more $100 a month on student loans if I'm making $4,000 a month more. So that's a way to potentially go back and add a skill and increase your human capital. So I thought that was really unique. Next up, we got two left, and I'm actually going to switch them because I wanted to leave the last one for you to talk a bit about what you do with your firm. So the second to last one was you not recommended, but you listed as an option, leaving the U.S.
Yeah, and the way this works is that your payments of your income-based payments are based off of your adjusted gross income, off your tax return. One way is which we said. Well, there's this thing called the Foreign Earned Income Exclusion Act, which allows you to write off your income up to 120 something $1,000 if you live out of the country 330 plus days out of the year, which is extreme, but there are people that are moving abroad for other reasons, quality of life, whatever. But that side benefit is that you get this above the line deduction. So now instead of your adjusted gross income, say being $100,000, your AGI may be zero, so long as you're able to take advantage of that foreign income exclusion. Now, I'm not saying anyone should leave the country simply because of their student loans, because I think there may be other ways to deal with that debt. But if you are someone who is kind of mapping out your next steps in life, it is something just to keep in your back pocket to consider, oh, here's what happened to my student loans. I actually can have a $0 payment on my student loans and still continue to receive credit toward forgiveness rather than simply just letting the loans default.
Before we hit record on this, he and I were talking about traveling abroad and living abroad and things of that nature. So, to your point, if it's something you were inclined to do anyways, it might work, but you might be disappointed if you're using it as a strategy and just leave the country with no quality of life thought in mind. All right, so we're gonna finish this up, and the reason I'm finishing on this is because not only have we never talked about it on the podcast before, but this is also something that I think is very misunderstood, and that is the potential or possibility of having federal student loans discharged in bankruptcy. So could you share a bit about whether it is true, not true, kind of what the scenario would need to be for them to potentially be discharged, if you could expound?
Yeah, and so from bankruptcy, it is possible to discharge federal and private student loans in bankruptcy, but not a part of your normal bankruptcy process. Now, what do I mean by that? So most people are familiar with bankruptcy kind of conceptually, that you file and it gets rid of your credit card debt, medical bills, card note, etc. And you're going to file one of two types of consumer bankruptcy. It's a Chapter 7 or a Chapter 13. In either of those instances, no matter which one you file, you will wipe out most of your debt, but you're going to leave with your student loans. They will follow you after. And so they're not discharged as part of your normal bankruptcy process. However, there is a process to do so called an adversary proceeding, which is effectively just a lawsuit that you file to say, hey, judge, these loans are an undue hardship to me. I should be able to get rid of them or discharge them. Now, historically, that's been really challenging to do because case law that developed over 20, 30 years made it challenging, and the rules were different all across the nation. And so what happened during the Biden administration, which kind of started under the Trump administration actually, is they wanted to improve this bankruptcy process to get this discharge of student loans in this adversary proceeding. And so in 2022, the Department of Justice worked with the Department of Education to come up with some guidelines in this new process. This new process called the attestation process, just a statement really, allows borrowers who meet certain conditions to have a better chance of having their loans discharged. Now, what are those kind of conditions? Typically, it's going to be someone who is 65 years or older, has been unemployed or underemployed for the last 5+ years, went to a school that was a sham school, like say a ITT Tech, and didn't receive value for that education, or they may have medical bills that make them not necessarily eligible for total and permanent disability, but also get in the way of their ability to earn income. It's not really meant for people who just graduated college and can't afford it, or some people who are just a few years out. It's actually meant for a longer term analysis of kind of someone been struggling with this for a while. That said, it's open to everyone to try and use, but who it's really meant to help out are those people who meet some of those conditions I laid out earlier.
Well, you have done a great job of summarizing what was in the newsletter. And I had you on to talk about that specifically, but I would never want to pigeonhole you to our audience about you only sharing strategies for someone who's trying to duck a payment. So I would love it if you would tell us where people can reach you, because you do give excellent strategies on repayment, navigating student loan debt, and more.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you giving that qualifier there, because I am definitely not someone that's out here looking for the loopholes or encouraging people not to pay their debt. I think we should all pay back our debts if we can reasonably do so. But there are going to be instances where people simply can't, and we need to talk about those things and have kind of clear understanding of pros, cons, consequences, and options. And so I go through all those types of things through our newsletter that you can find at tateesq.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn, Stanley Tate. I'm there, and on YouTube, Student Loan Lawyer. We're right there on all those channels. And thank you for having me here. And I'm definitely happy to come back whenever to kind of talk through all these different options.
Absolutely. If you all are listening to this, like I said, we will put all of his information in the show notes. I encourage you to check out what he puts out. And as we are trying to do our best to have your student loans forgiven, reduced, reorganized, and expedited, I want to put as many people in front of you as can help you on that journey. We'll see you soon. From Escape Student Loan Debt, this was the Escape Student Loan Debt Podcast, a show for established professionals whose student loan payments or loan balances are impacting their marriage, their business, their credit, or their